The fluorescent lights hum at a frequency that most people stop hearing after 3 days. Ashley Cooper never stopped hearing it. She heard it the way soldiers hear the diesel idle of a transport truck, as data, as warning, as the baseline rhythm against which everything else registered as disruption. She moved through Cedar Creek Medical's emergency department at 11:48 p.m. on a Tuesday, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she restocked Trauma Bay 3. Saline bags in ascending order. Gauze packs nested by size. The crash cart's defibrillator pads checked for conductivity, a habit from before, from a place she didn't allow herself to think about in public. From a place where the difference between a 3-second delay and a 4-second delay meant someone's daughter never came home. The other nurses noticed her. They always did. Not because she was remarkable, but because she was invisible in a way that made them uncomfortable. She took report without writing anything down, just listened, her dark eyes moving across faces, cataloging details with the precision of someone building a target package. She didn't laugh at jokes in the break room. She didn't complain about her feet or her schedule or Dr. Mercer, who walked through the department like he'd personally invented emergency medicine and was still waiting for the world to offer adequate thanks. Near the medication dispensary, 2 nurses whispered while pulling from the controlled substance safe. Ashley was 5 feet away, pretending to inventory the oxygen tubing on the wall. "She's too calm," the first nurse said. Her name tag read Jennifer. She'd been at Cedar Creek for 4 years and still flinched when the trauma alert sounded. "Like nothing touches her." "Creepy calm," the second nurse agreed. "I've never seen her stressed. Never seen her rush. It's like she's on some kind of autopilot. My mom's therapist said that's dissociation. That people who've been through trauma just zone out." Ashley didn't turn around. She continued wrapping the oxygen tubing around her forearm with methodical precision, the movements economical and clean. The whispers were information. The whispers told her how she was being perceived. How safe she was. How far from exposure. She wore a faded denim jacket over her scrubs during shift changes, the fabric worn soft at the cuffs and frayed at the collar. Most of her colleagues assumed it was a sentimental item, something from college, maybe, or an old boyfriend. No one ever mentioned it. No one ever asked why she kept it in her locker with the same reverence other people reserved for wedding rings. When she reached for the oxygen tubing on the higher shelf, her right sleeve rode up 3 inches. The burn scar started at her wrist and ran to her elbow in patterns that didn't match anything civilian medicine could explain. Not accidental. Not random. Those scars belonged to a specific moment, a convoy truck, 2011, the blast happening in slow motion the way explosions always did, and her hands pushing against the hot metal of the door panel while her left leg refused to move because the femur was fractured in a way that required surgical reconstruction. The scars also told another story. The one under her jacket. The one sewn into the lining with 4 careful stitches that she'd done herself in a hotel room in 2009, using a needle and thread she'd stolen from a trauma kit in Kandahar. The unit patch was so worn that the insignia was barely visible anymore, just a suggestion of an insignia, the way a face is barely visible through heavy fog. But she could trace it with her fingertips in the dark. She'd done that exactly 847 times since she was discharged. Not out of nostalgia. Out of verification. Making sure it was still there. Making sure the person who wore it hadn't been completely erased. Dr. Richard Mercer arrived for his 11 p.m. shift at 10:58 p.m., 2 minutes early, the way he arrived for everything. 52 years old, silver hair that he had touched up every 6 weeks at a salon in Buckhead, white coat pressed with the kind of creases that suggested military background, except he'd never served. His father had served. His grandfather had served. He carried their service like a credit card he could flash at any moment to prove something about himself. He was tall enough that people looked up when he entered a room. He had a voice that made people listen, not because what he said was necessarily correct, but because he said it with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything he'd decided to be right about. In the ED, that made him a problem. In the ED, that made him dangerous in the way that competent people could be dangerous, not because they were incompetent, but because they didn't second-guess themselves, and second-guessing was what kept people from killing patients. He moved through the main department, nodding at residents, checking the sensors board, and then his eyes landed on Trauma Bay 3, where Ashley was performing a final visual inspection of the crash cart. She had the cart open and was verifying medication concentrations, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was the kind of thing captain-level personnel did in the quiet hours, the kind of invisible quality control that kept people alive. Dr. Mercer watched her for exactly 9 seconds. His gaze moved from her face to her hands to the way she stood, weight distributed evenly, knees slightly bent, ready to move in any direction with equal speed. He catalogued it all with the expression of a man who'd just identified a problem that needed solving. Then he turned to the charge nurse. "Who's assigned to trauma tonight?" "Cooper in 3. Jackson in 1. Reeves is floating." Dr. Mercer made a note in his mind. Ashley Cooper. The quiet one. The one who moved like she had somewhere else to be, or like she'd trained to move in a way that didn't waste energy. He'd been at Cedar Creek for 7 years, and in that time, he'd learned that nurse who stood out were the ones who'd either inherited institutional knowledge from good preceptors, or who were operating well above their pay grade and hadn't yet been caught overstepping. He suspected Ashley fell into the second category. The kind of nurse who performed advanced skills without certification. The kind of nurse who made independent decisions in gaps between doctor orders. The kind of nurse who, if something went wrong, would leave a liability trail that led back to Cedar Creek Medical like blood spatter evidence. At 2:04 a.m., the trauma alert sounded. The sound wasn't particularly loud, just a series of pulsing tones that cut through the ambient hum of monitors and conversations. But everything in the ED recognized it. The rhythm changed. The pace accelerated. Residents stood. Nurses moved toward their assigned bays without being asked. Ashley was already moving before dispatch finished speaking, stabbing victim, 3 penetrating chest wounds, ETA 2 minutes, vitals unstable, SWAT clearing the scene. She moved through Trauma Bay 1 like she'd choreographed the space in her mind already. The monitors came online with a series of beeps and hisses. She logged into the computer with credentials that worked and shouldn't have. Someone had given her nurse-level access years ago and no one had ever revoked it, probably because she never used it for anything but immediate medical necessity. She was pulling up a 14-gauge angiocath when the patient came through the doors. The man was 32 years old, muscular, bleeding from 3 separate wounds on his chest and left shoulder. His shirt was gone. His vital signs were bad. His breathing was shallow. His oxygen saturation was 78% and dropping like a stone down a well. Dr. Mercer was in the trauma bay already, calling orders, his voice filling the space with authority and confidence. An intern was trying to get peripheral access. Another resident was reaching for the chest tube kit. The respiratory therapist was standing by with an intubation kit because the patient's airway was going to become the primary problem in approximately 60 seconds. Ashley observed all of this for about 4 seconds. Then her hands moved without waiting for orders. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She'd done this procedure in exactly 47 hostile environments, and in this climate-controlled trauma bay with proper lighting and equipment that actually worked, her hands moved like they were operating on muscle memory that existed in a space separate from her conscious mind. The needle advanced. The chest wall gave way with the familiar sensation of tissue separating. Then air. The hiss of pressurized air escaping from a collapsed lung finding decompression. O2 sat was 78. Then 82. Then 88. Climbing. Dr. Mercer looked up from the cardiac monitor where he was calling out rhythms. He watched Ashley tape the needle in place with movements that suggested not just competence but a familiarity with the procedure that seemed to exist at a level deeper than professional training. The kind of familiarity that came from repetition in conditions where failure meant someone died in your arms. "Good placement," he said. Which was what he said when residents did things correctly, except his tone suggested something else, a note of surprise, maybe, or the beginning of the calculation that would define the next 7 years of his campaign against her. The patient's breathing improved. His oxygen saturation stabilized in the low 90s. The bleeding was still a problem, but the immediate respiratory crisis had shifted into secondary status. An intern had successfully placed a central line. The surgical team was being called down from upstairs. The patient was going to need operating room time, but he was going to make it to the operating room alive, which was the fundamental difference between the patients who lived and the patients who became case studies in mortality and morbidity rounds. Ashley was finishing the taping when the grizzled man in Trauma Bay 2, a stabbing victim from 40 minutes earlier, waiting for his own surgical consultation, watched her hands move through the final steps of the procedure. He was a patient, yes, but he was also something else. His chart read military background. His medical history included blast trauma and shrapnel wounds and an incident in 2007 that was redacted at the federal level. He watched Ashley's hands with the focus of someone who recognized the thing they were seeing. When she turned away from the patient, he called out to her in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Baghdad, right? I'd know that pressure technique anywhere." The room didn't go quiet. It was already full of voices and monitors and the general chaos of a trauma situation. But Ashley's body stiffened in a way that was almost imperceptible. Her jaw tightened. Her hands paused for exactly 1.3 seconds before she continued moving toward the medication cabinet to log the supplies she'd used. She didn't acknowledge the comment. She didn't turn around. She didn't offer any explanation or confirmation or denial. She simply continued her work as if the man in Trauma Bay 2 had not spoken at all, as if words had no power to reach backward into the past and drag things into the present. But the man had seen something in that microscopic moment of stillness. The recognition. The confirmation. The way her jaw worked when she was processing information that should have remained classified. He settled back into his hospital bed, a smile crossing his weathered face. He'd served in the 75th Ranger Regiment from 2002 to 2009. He knew what he'd seen in her hands. He knew what a combat pressure technique looked like when it was performed by someone who'd used it on 9 different patients, all of whom had survived their initial wounds. Ashley finished logging the supplies. She checked the patient's vitals one more time. She documented her actions in the trauma record with clinical precision and no extra words. Then she stepped out of Trauma Bay 1 and continued her shift as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The man in Trauma Bay 2 knew something now. And in a hospital where everything eventually became known, knowledge was a weapon that could fire in unexpected directions. Thursday morning at Cedar Creek Medical arrived with fluorescent brightness and 30 resident physicians crowded into the conference room like fish in an aquarium. Dr. Mercer stood at the front, patient chart already projected on the screen behind him, and Ashley stood at the back wall with her arms crossed, waiting for what she already knew was coming. "Let me show you an example," Dr. Mercer announced, his voice carrying the particular timbre of a man about to perform, of dangerous improvisation by undertrained staff. The chart magnified. Ashley's handwriting filled the screen, clinical, precise, economical. Patient presented with penetrating thoracic trauma. Diminished breath sounds bilateral. JVD present. Needle decompression performed in field prior to transport arrival. Dr. Mercer's lip curled. "Nurses do not perform needle decompressions," he said, reading each word like it tasted of copper. "Nurses do not diagnose tension pneumothorax. Nurses do not make field decisions that could result in punctured cardiac tissue, coronary artery laceration, or massive hemorrhage." He turned to face the residents directly. But Nurse Cooper here apparently watched a training video and decided to play doctor. Laughter scattered through the room like glass breaking. The residents exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others openly smirking. One wrote something in his notebook and circled it twice. Ashley's stare never wavered. Cold. Flat as a frozen lake. The patient survived, Dr. Mercer continued, despite her cowboy medicine, not because of it. This is what happens when we let people without proper training make life or death decisions. This is the liability we face every single day in this department. He turned back to the screen, letting the full weight of his contempt hang in the air like humidity before a storm. "Let's move on to the next case." But the damage was already done. The resident stopped looking at the chart and started looking at Ashley, assessing her, cataloguing her incompetence, already deciding which doctors they would work with and which ones to avoid. Her chart had become a teaching tool for what happens when you exceed your credentials. A warning label on a dangerous substance. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't acknowledge any of it. 3 days later, on Thursday afternoon, Ashley stood at the vending machine with $3 in hand, hunting for something that wasn't there. The machine had taken her money once before. She wasn't expecting it to be fair this time either. Dr. Mercer approached from behind, moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never experienced consequences, and leaned against the adjacent machine, blocking her exit. "I've been making calls, Cooper," he said quietly. Conversationally, as if they were friends discussing the weather. "Checked with HR about your credentials." Ashley fed her dollars into the slot without responding. "Your nursing degree is legitimate," he continued, "barely, from some online program. I'd need to look again, but I think it was from a school that operates out of a strip mall in Jacksonville. No ICU certification. No trauma specialty. ACLS certification is current, yes, but that's the bare minimum. Anyone with a pulse can pass that exam." He paused. Shifted his weight. "You're playing nurse, and someone playing pretend in my department will end up killing someone." The machine hummed. Ashley's Sprite tumbled down the chute. She retrieved it, turned it over in her hands, studying the label as if it contained answers. "You might want to leave before security escorts you out," Dr. Mercer said. "Save yourself the embarrassment. I'm sure there are other facilities looking for entry-level staff. Places where expectations are lower. Where people understand their limitations." Ashley cracked the Sprite open. The carbonation hissed, a small sound, barely audible, but it seemed to fill the space between them. She turned slowly and met his eyes. Her gaze was the color of a stormy Atlantic, and something in her expression made the air pressure change. "You wouldn't recognize real medicine," she said, "if it was keeping your heart beating." Then she walked past him toward the trauma bay, and Dr. Mercer's face turned the color of raw liver. His mouth worked soundlessly for 3 full seconds, words trying to form, none of them strong enough to break the surface. By the time he found his voice, she was already gone, and his apology was swallowed by the hospital machinery that never stopped running. That afternoon, the new schedule appeared in everyone's mailbox. Permanent night shift assignment. Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Paired exclusively with first-year residents who had started 3 weeks ago. Residents who still consulted their handbooks before drawing up medications. Residents who froze during crises instead of moving. Residents who saw Ashley as a resource but never as a leader. It was a strategic move, perfectly disguised as routine scheduling. Dr. Mercer wasn't just removing her from the day shift where she'd built trust with the senior attending physicians. He was isolating her with the weakest medical staff in the hospital, creating the conditions for her to fail spectacularly when something went wrong. And something always went wrong in trauma. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he did it so cleanly that no one could even call it retaliation. For consecutive nights passed in the mechanical rhythm of the midnight emergency department, Ashley moved through each shift with the invisible precision of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility was a form of armor. She started fours without wasting motion. She communicated with the first-year residents in short, clear instructions that bypassed panic and went straight to action. She made decisions quietly, with the kind of certainty that made younger doctors follow her lead without questioning why they were taking orders from someone officially beneath them on the hospital hierarchy. On her 4th night, at 2:07 a.m., paramedics burst through the trauma bay doors with a patient who looked like someone had tried to unzip him from the sternum down. 19-year-old male, 3 penetrating stab wounds to the anterior chest, the paramedic called out while jogging beside the stretcher. Knife approximately 6 inches, initial BP 140/80, now 92/54 and falling. Lost a lot of blood at the scene. 2 large bore fours already established. The first-year resident assigned to work with Ashley that night was named David Chen, and his hand started shaking before the patient even reached the bay. Ashley was already moving. She didn't ask permission. Didn't consult. She grabbed fresh gloves, established a third four without hesitation, initiated massive transfusion protocol. Type O negative, push it, she called to the resident. Get me a central line kit and activate the trauma surgeon. David Chen moved like someone operating in slow motion. His fingers wouldn't cooperate with the buttons on the supply cabinet. He forgot what he was supposed to be doing twice in 30 seconds. The patient's oxygen saturation began its descent. 92. 88. 81. Ashley was listening for something specific, the absence of breath sounds on the right side. She heard it immediately. Felt the tracheal deviation when she placed her hand on the patient's neck. The jugular veins were distending like they were being inflated from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. Her hands knew what to do before her brain finished the diagnosis. Needle decompression, she announced. She didn't ask for equipment. She reached for a 14-gauge angiocath needle and identified the second intercostal space by touch alone, the right position on the first attempt, no hesitation, the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory forged in a place where mistakes meant watching someone die in the dirt. She drove the needle through the chest wall at a 45-degree angle. 3-count insertion. Clean. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and unmistakable, the sound of pressure releasing, the whisper of a lung that had been collapsed like a fist finally allowed to open. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed. 72. 80. 94. Stable. David Chen's shaking hands finally caught up to his brain. What do I? Get the trauma surgeon. Now, Ashley said, already preparing the patient for imaging. Her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a request anymore. In the next bay, separated only by a curtain, a man in his 60s with a broken leg had been watching the entire performance through the gap between the privacy curtains. His name was Thomas Chen, former army, former medic, the kind of man who recognized precision when he saw it because he'd spent 22 years learning the difference between luck and training. He'd been watching Ashley since she started her shift. Watching how she moved through the department like someone who had done this before under circumstances infinitely worse. When she performed the needle decompression, he sat up straighter despite the pain radiating through his femur. He recognized the angle of insertion. The pressure applied. The 3-count timing. There was only one unit that had taught field needle decompression with that specific technique, in that exact time window, and only to special operations personnel. Ashley walked past his bay afterward to dispose of the needle, and that's when Chen called out. Baghdad, right. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. I'd know that pressure technique anywhere. Ashley stopped moving. Completely still. Her hands held the needle container, but the rest of her seemed to pause, a 2-second break in her composure, the first visible reaction anyone had witnessed in months. She turned slowly and looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something he'd seen before, in the faces of people who had survived things they weren't supposed to survive. 3-count insertion, he continued quietly. 45-degree angle. No hesitation. No doubt. They only taught that one place, one unit, 2008 to 2012. Ashley met his gaze with the full weight of whatever she was carrying, and Thomas Chen understood in that single moment that he was looking at a ghost, someone who had learned to move like a living person, but hadn't quite mastered the living part. You're mistaken, she said quietly. Her hand moved unconsciously to her jacket pocket, where the faded unit patch lay hidden against her ribs, sewn so carefully into the lining that no one in the hospital would ever see it. I've never been to Baghdad. Chen nodded slowly, understanding everything she wasn't saying. My mistake, he replied. Must be the pain meds. But after Ashley walked away, he pulled out his phone and started typing a message to someone he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Then he stopped. Deleted it. Put the phone down and stared at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had just realized that the rumors were true, that she was still alive, and that whatever she was doing in Cedar Creek Medical, it was only a matter of time before someone else figured out what he'd figured out. The master schedule changed 3 days later. Ashley checked the posted rotation on the break room bulletin board during her lunch shift and saw what Dr. Mercer had done. Night shifts. All of them. 7 consecutive nights, starting immediately. But that wasn't the worst part. The staffing assignments were surgical in their precision. Each trauma case would find her paired with residents in their first or second month, the ones still fumbling with central line placements, the ones who called attending physicians for basic airway decisions. 1 respiratory therapist instead of 2. The surgical tech would be rotating, never the same person twice. And the pharmacy tech assigned to her shifts was Marcus, a good man but methodical, the kind who followed protocol to the letter and never improvised, which meant critical drug pushes that should take 90 seconds would take 3 minutes. Ashley didn't protest. She didn't request reassignment. She picked up the schedule, read it twice, and folded it into her pocket. The other nurses in the break room exchanged glances. Nobody said anything. They'd already learned not to. What they didn't know was that Dr. Mercer had made 3 phone calls that same morning. First to the nursing director's office, his voice measured and concerned. "I'm raising a patient safety flag about some clinical decisions I've observed. Nothing accusatory, you understand. I just think we need enhanced oversight on staff with non-traditional credential paths. For liability purposes." The director listened while Mercer painted a careful picture, not of Ashley specifically, but of a generic nurse with military field training who might confuse emergency department protocols with battlefield triage. Dangerous, he suggested. Unpredictable. The kind of liability that keeps hospital administrators awake. The second call went to the chief of surgery. Same tone. Same careful language. "I'm concerned about supervision gaps in the trauma bay. There's a staff member with excellent technical skills but questionable clinical judgment. I think we should require attending physician approval before certain personnel enter during critical situations. Just a safety measure." The third call was to the credentialing committee. This time he didn't even name Ashley. He simply proposed a new policy, enhanced specialty certification verification for staff working in high acuity areas. "I think it's prudent. These are critical patients." The policy passed quietly. Nobody read the credential matrix closely enough to notice it perfectly described one person. But that wasn't the worst part either. The access card to the trauma bay, the one that usually required a simple badge swipe, suddenly needed additional authorization. A page request to an attending physician. A 30-second wait that could stretch to 2 minutes if the attending was in surgery or in a meeting. A policy that looked reasonable on paper. Patient safety. Chain of custody. Enhanced accountability. All true. All designed to slow her down just enough that response time suffered. 3 days after the schedule change, during a department meeting about improved communication protocols, Dr. Mercer stood at the front of the conference room and proposed something new. "I think we should implement a peer review system for clinical decisions made during high acuity situations. Not to second guess, to verify. Especially for staff with non-traditional background certifications." He wasn't looking at Ashley when he said it. He was looking past her, at the wall. "We can't afford mistakes. These are critical patients." The policy passed. Ashley sat in the third row, next to a resident who suddenly wouldn't meet her eyes. She didn't move. She didn't protest. She simply folded her hands and listened while Dr. Mercer carefully constructed an architecture of friction around her every shift. That evening in the break room, one of the nurses, Claire, who'd been kind to Ashley during her first month, touched her shoulder gently. "He's building a record," Claire whispered. "I don't know what happened between you two, but he's building a case. You should talk to the union rep." Ashley looked at her and said nothing. The union rep would ask questions. Questions meant investigation. Investigation meant attention. Attention meant risk. The entire point of Cedar Creek Medical had been to disappear into it, to become invisible, to heal people without anyone asking why her hands moved the way they did or how she knew what to do before the attending physician did. She'd signed on to the night shift knowing exactly what it meant. Isolation. Inexperienced residents who would question her decisions. Residents she would have to teach in real time while patients coded. No surgical tech on standby meant improvisation with equipment. No second respiratory therapist meant triage decisions made without consultation. And Marcus from pharmacy, bless him, would follow the book exactly as written, which meant every critical decision would take longer to execute. Dr. Mercer had found the perfect way to undermine her without directly interfering with treatment. He was building a machine that would either force her to fail or force her to bend protocol in ways that could be documented, criticized, used as ammunition in whatever endgame he was constructing. The night shift started. They were exactly as bad as the scheduling implied. An 11-year-old with a crushing chest injury from a bicycle accident came in during her third night. The resident with her was named Trevor, and he was still learning how to interpret chest radiographs. The surgical tech assigned was someone Ashley had never worked with. The attending physician was in the OR. The respiratory therapist was alone in the bay with 3 other ventilated patients. Ashley paged for the attending, waited for approval to enter the trauma bay, then pushed through the double doors and found Trevor standing over the radiograph, rotating it slowly like it might make more sense from a different angle. Flail segment, anterior ribs for through 6, Ashley said quietly. She was already assessing the boy's work of breathing, watching the paradoxical movement of his chest wall. Positive pressure ventilation. Bear hugger for hypothermia prevention. We need him wrapped and prepped for observation. Should we intubate? Trevor asked. Ashley didn't answer immediately. She moved to the bedside and placed her hands on the boy's chest, feeling the instability, assessing the mechanics. This was the kind of decision that required experience Trevor didn't have, judgment that came from seeing 100 similar cases, from having sat in the dirt of a combat hospital in Helmand Province watching respiratory therapists manage similar injuries with nothing but positive pressure and time. Not yet, she said. But he's close. If his oxygen sat drops below 90% or his breathing gets worse, we intubate immediately. I'll watch him. You coordinate with OR for a post-op bed. Trevor nodded and left. The respiratory therapist was occupied with 2 other patients. The surgical tech was prepping another bay. And Ashley stood beside an 11-year-old boy whose chest looked like someone had struck him with a sledgehammer, her hands perfectly steady, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the crisis curve. That was how it went. Night after night. Underfunded teams. Inexperienced residents. Response times that stretched too long. And Ashley moving through each shift with the same invisible precision she'd maintained from her first day. Except now the other nurses noticed. They saw how she never panicked when protocols broke down. They watched her navigate the restrictions Dr. Mercer had imposed without ever complaining, without ever cutting corners, without ever giving him the ammunition he was clearly trying to manufacture. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened on a rainy Wednesday evening at 6:33 p.m., when a 250-pound man in a stained canvas jacket crashed through the emergency department entrance with enough force to crack the reinforced glass door. He was screaming before he hit the floor. Screaming names. Screaming accusations. His face was the color of raw meat, and veins stood out on his neck like rope. Where is he? Mercer. Where's the doctor who killed my brother? The waiting room had 43 people. 17 of them were children. An elderly woman with a walker was trying to shuffle toward the bathroom exit. A teenager with a broken wrist sat frozen in a plastic chair. Parents pulled their sick children close. Someone's phone clattered to the ground. The man's right hand went inside his jacket. Everyone moved at once. Security guards backed away, reaching for their radios. The family in the corner started screaming. A woman with a stroller ran toward the secured hallway. People knocked over chairs. People dropped belongings. The waiting room became a stampede in reverse, everyone trying to get away from the center, away from the massive man with his hand inside his jacket, away from whatever was about to happen. Dr. Mercer was at the nurse's station reviewing charts. The sound of the initial crash made him look up, and when he saw the man's face, when he heard the screaming, his charts fell from his hands. He dropped to the floor behind the reception desk, pulling a terrified medical student down with him, covering his head with his hands like that would save him. Every staff member with a line of sight to the waiting room ran for the secured treatment areas. Every single one. The safety protocol was clear: lock down, secure the clinical areas, wait for security. Don't engage. Don't approach. Get to safety and let trained personnel handle the threat. Ashley Cooper was standing at the threshold of triage room 3, reviewing the chart of a patient with suspected pneumonia. The screaming registered. The chaos registered. She looked up and saw the man, saw his size, saw his rage, saw his hand still inside his jacket. And something in the way he was standing, something in the angle of his posture, something in the sheen of sweat on his forehead that went beyond just anger. Pain was information. She set down the chart and walked directly toward him with her hands visible at shoulder height, palms open, moving slowly. The waiting room went dead silent. Every person who was still visible, still in the open, stopped moving. The man's attention locked onto her like a targeting system acquiring a lock. His hand came out of his jacket slightly, just enough for her to see it was empty. Just a hand. Just a man. "I need you to look at me," Ashley said quietly. Her voice was different from the one Cedar Creek Medical had heard. Lower. Steadier. The voice of someone who had spent time talking down people far more dangerous than this. "What's your name?" "He killed him," the man gasped. He was pointing now, his hand shaking. "The doctor. Mercer. He operated on my brother and he killed him. It was supposed to be routine. Supposed to be simple. And he came out and said there were complications and my brother was dead." Ashley kept her hands visible and moved closer. "Tell me about your brother. What was his name?" "Marcus." The man's voice cracked. Marcus was 28. 28 years old. He had 2 kids. And that doctor killed him. Ashley continued moving toward him, speaking in the same steady voice that had once talked a Taliban fighter into laying down his weapon, that had negotiated with terrified civilians in the chaos of street fighting. "I believe you. I believe your brother's death was real. I believe you loved him. And I believe you're in pain right now." She was close enough now to see the tremors in his hands, the way his breathing was shallow, the pallor beneath his anger. "But I need you to sit down for me. Can you do that?" The man looked at her, and something in her voice, something in the steadiness of her posture, something in the absolute absence of fear in her face made him hesitate. His breathing accelerated. His hand went to his abdomen. "Sit down," Ashley said. Not a request. A command. He Saturday. He collapsed into the nearest chair like his legs had given out. And that was when Ashley saw it, the way his abdomen was rigid, the slight lean to his left, the grimace that went beyond just rage. Internal bleeding. Or abdominal wound. Something catastrophic. The man looked at her with eyes that were starting to glaze, and he said, "I came to kill him. I came here to kill the doctor." "I know," Ashley said. "But you're not going to do that. Because you're dying, and right now I'm the only person here who can help you." The waiting room exploded into motion. A man, 250 pounds of rage and desperation, crashed through the automatic doors screaming for the doctor who killed his brother. Patients scattered like startled birds. A mother grabbed her child. An elderly couple dove behind a potted plant. Security reached for their radios. Everyone moved away. Everyone except Ashley. She stood from the triage desk and walked directly toward him. Her hands were visible, palms open, fingers spread. Not threatening. Not defensive. Offering. The man swung toward her, his eyes wild, pupils dilated like he'd been running on adrenaline and rage for hours. His shirt was stained dark at the abdomen. He was hurt. He was bleeding. But he didn't know it yet. "My name is Ashley," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It never did. "What's your name? Don't come near me." He raised his fist, trembling. Not with fear. With something else. Something breaking. "I'm not armed." Ashley kept her distance, kept her tone level, kept her body language open. "I'm a nurse. I'm here to help. Tell me your brother's name." "Marcus Webb. He came in Friday with stomach pain. Your doctor sent him home with tums." "With tums?" "He died Sunday." The words cracked on the last one. Broke like thin ice under weight. Ashley had heard breakage like that before, in detention facilities and checkpoints, in voices belonging to people who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. She recognized the pattern. She knew what came next. "That's a failure," she said, and meant it. "You have every right to be angry. But you're hurt too. I can see it." She took one measured step closer. "Let me help you first. Then we'll find out what happened to Marcus." The tone was the same one she'd used on scared civilians at Baghdad checkpoints, on cornered combatants, on people teetering at the edge of violence. The voice that said, "I am neither afraid nor a threat." The voice that said, "I see you." David Webb's hand trembled. He wasn't holding a gun. He was clutching his abdomen, and his fingers were wet. "You're bleeding," Ashley said. Not a question. A diagnosis. Internal bleed. Probably the same thing Marcus had. "If you don't let me help you right now, you'll die like he did." His eyes widened. His knees buckled. Ashley caught him as he dropped, lowering him to the waiting room floor with the kind of controlled descent that came from muscle memory, from practicing this move on bleeding soldiers in the dust. His shirt rode up. His abdomen was distended, rigid, the color wrong. Peritoneal bleeding. Minutes, not hours. She was already screaming for a gurney, for a trauma kit, for O2 and an N4 setup. She knew there was no time for transport to surgery. No time for the elevator. No time for anything but this. Ashley pulled a scalpel from her pocket. She'd carried one since Baghdad. Not for show. For this. "I need to open your chest," she said, keeping her voice steady, keeping it level. "You have internal bleeding compressing your heart. You'll die in 3 minutes without this. Do you understand?" David Webb managed a nod. Barely conscious. Barely there. Ashley's hands moved on their own, muscle memory, neural pathways carved by 6 years of combat medicine, by holding people together in the dark. She cut between his ribs with precision that belonged to someone who'd done this under mortar fire, someone who'd done this 100 times. The sternum spread. The chest cavity opened. Blood pooled on the linoleum, warm and copper-smelling, and she reached inside to manually compress the heart, to locate the bleed, to buy him minutes while the world watched. A resident appeared with a crash cart and froze in place like someone had hit pause on his body. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Dr. Mercer remained behind the reception desk, his face visible just above the counter. He was watching. His expression moved between shock and vindication, between horror and the terrible satisfaction of being proven right about something he'd gotten catastrophically wrong. Ashley's hands worked. Compress. Locate. Control. The man's vital signs began to stabilize. O2 sat climbing. Pulse returning. The bleeding contained by sheer manual pressure and the kind of focus that came from having already seen the worst the world could offer. "Get him to surgery. Now," Ashley said. Not a request. A command. They moved. Security arrived and took David Webb into custody as he was wheeled toward the surgical bay. Ashley remained on the waiting room floor with blood on her scrubs, with her hand shaking in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the restraint it took not to break something. Hospital administrators began appearing. They whispered about liability, protocol, unauthorized procedures, practicing medicine without a license. The words floated over her like she wasn't there, like she was already a ghost. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 hours later, after David Webb came out of surgery stable and alive, after the surgical team confirmed that without that intervention he would have died on the waiting room floor, Ashley was called into the conference room. The nursing director, the hospital administrator, the compliance officer. They asked for her badge. They asked for her access card. They read the suspension notice aloud, pending investigation into unauthorized surgical procedures, practicing medicine without a license, reckless endangerment of hospital staff and patients. She listened with a cold, flat stare. That evening, Ashley stood at a bus stop on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, rain hammering the shelter like applause from a crowd that had never seen her move. She held a cardboard box containing a cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent someone had left on her locker, and a photograph of her unit in Baghdad. 12 faces. 6 of them crossed out in permanent marker. Water dripped from her hair. Her denim jacket was soaked through. The fabric clung to her shoulders like something trying to hold her together from the outside, failing. For the first time in 3 years, she looked like someone who had finally run out of places to hide. The bus pulled up at 5:06 p.m. She didn't board it. She stood there, rain streaming down her face, the box getting heavier, the dead plant in her hands like the last thing she had left to prove she'd ever existed at all. The bus pulled away. Brake lights disappeared into the Atlanta evening. At that exact moment, 43 miles north at the Pentagon, an automated alert was firing across classified servers. A routine background check for a hospital suspension had flagged something buried so deep in encrypted files that it triggered an immediate national security protocol. Someone's security clearance code didn't match her personnel file. Someone's identity markers were buried under layers of redaction that dated back 13 years. Within 48 hours, the query would move up the chain. The chain would move up faster. But Ashley didn't know that yet. She just stood at the bus stop in the rain, holding the last piece of evidence that she'd ever been captain. The routine background check processed exactly 48 hours after the waiting room incident. Cedar Creek Medical's compliance office ran Ashley's information through standard federal databases, a formality for any suspension with potential liability claims. The check was supposed to take 3 days. It took 40 minutes. The system flagged a classified security clearance code buried so deep in the Pentagon's archives that it triggered an automatic alert. Not a warning. An alert. The kind that moves through secure channels at 3 in the morning, the kind that ends with a phone call to someone who answers on the first ring, always. By dawn, the hospital's administrative conference room had been commandeered. 2 FBI agents in dark suits sat across from the hospital administrator, their laptops connected to encrypted networks, their phones silenced. A third agent stood near the door, watching the hallway. They had already photographed Dr. Mercer's login records. They had already interviewed the nursing director. They had already confirmed what the timestamp screamed, 47 unauthorized accesses to Ashley Cooper's personnel file over the course of 6 weeks. The Brigadier General arrived at 7:15 a.m. in a military sedan with tinted windows. She wore her dress uniform, service blues with ribbon spanning her chest like a map of decisions made in rooms without windows. Her boots clicked against the tile floor like a countdown nobody wanted to hear. She carried a single file folder marked classified, and when she set it on the conference table, the sound was like a judge's gavel. "Where is Captain Cooper?" she asked. Not a request. A command. The hospital administrator pointed down the hallway. The Brigadier General nodded once and continued walking. Ashley was restocking the trauma bay's medication cart, methodical, precise, muscle memory from 1,000 shifts. She didn't hear the footsteps because she was listening to the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, that mechanical metronome that meant someone was fighting hard to breathe. The general stopped in the doorway. Ashley didn't turn around. She felt the presence the way you feel pressure drop before a storm hits. Captain Cooper. The word hung there. Just her rank. Just her name. Ashley's hand stopped moving. She turned slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, someone who outranked her was standing in a trauma bay at Cedar Creek Medical, Atlanta. The Brigadier General's eyes moved across Ashley's face like she was reading a book written in a language she'd almost forgotten. Ashley said quietly. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The General's gaze dropped to Ashley's white coat, where the faded Special Forces unit patch was sewn into the lining, barely visible unless you knew to look. The General's hand came up slowly. Her salute was perfect, fist to chest, the kind that acknowledges not rank but legend. But that wasn't the worst part. In the ICU, David Webb was awake. He'd been unconscious for 36 hours after the surgery, and when he opened his eyes yesterday, the first thing he saw was the monitor showing his own heartbeat climbing back toward normal. The second thing he saw was the face of the nurse who'd cut him open in a waiting room while everyone else scattered like smoke. She was checking his lines, quiet, methodical, the way she'd checked everything. Hands that moved like they'd done this 1,000 times in places that didn't exist on any map. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. His throat was raw from intubation. She noticed. She adjusted his foot-drip, gave him a sip of water with a straw, and didn't ask questions when he started to cry. This morning, he whispered when he saw her again. 3 syllables. The call sign. A name he shouldn't have known, that nobody outside a certain room in Fort Bragg would have recognized. Reaper 6. Ashley's hands froze. The foot bag swayed slightly from the movement. In the hallway, 2 Marines in dress uniforms went completely still. They were security escorts, assigned by the Pentagon to monitor the situation. One of them pulled out his phone with shaking hands. His thumb moved across the screen. He read the citation silently, his lips moving without sound. The text read, "For extraordinary valor under fire in support of Operation Enduring Freedom." Through her selfless actions and exceptional composure under extreme duress, Captain Ashley Cooper provided medical care to 17 coalition personnel while under direct fire, sustaining injuries herself but refusing evacuation until all patients were stabilized. Her action saved the lives of 8 service members who would have died without immediate intervention. He had no idea who was standing in front of him. David Webb's brother, the man with the concealed abdominal rupture, the one who'd walked into Cedar Creek Medical screaming for the doctor who killed his family. He was looking at the reason his brother was still breathing. The conference room fell silent when Dr. Mercer burst through the doors. His white coat was still perfect. His hair was still perfect. His face was not. It had the color and texture of old meat left in the sun. What is the meaning of this invasion? His voice cracked on the second word. This is my hospital. These are my staff. I demand to know why federal agents are in my... The Brigadier General turned to face him. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. When she looked at him, it was the kind of look that's been perfected over 40 years of telling men to do impossible things. Dr. Mercer. I'm Brigadier General Sarah Holloway, Deputy Director of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. You are being questioned regarding the falsification of federal employment records, the unauthorized alteration of protected government personnel files, and the creation of fraudulent documentation with intent to harm a federal employee. The room's air pressure changed. You could feel it in your chest. The FBI agent opened her laptop. The screen displayed a log of access records, timestamps, IP addresses, files opened, duration of access. 47 entries. All of them from Dr. Mercer's hospital login. June 14, 11:13 p.m., the agent said, reading. You accessed Captain Cooper's file and altered her certification dates. That's a routine quality assurance. June 15, 1:32 a.m. You created a new incident report claiming unauthorized medication administration. We interviewed 5 nurses. None of them witnessed any incident. The event never occurred. I was protecting. June 21st, 3:44 p.m. You backdated a credential lapse that has no supporting documentation. 60 seconds of file access, enough time to insert for separate false warnings. Dr. Mercer sat down. He didn't choose to. His legs simply failed. The agent continued. We also found evidence of a pattern. 3 other nurses, 2 physician assistants. You targeted competent staff with non-traditional credentials. You reassigned them, altered their schedules, created documentation of concerns you raised with other administrators that those staff members categorically deny. In the case of Dr. Michael Torres, you reported him to the hospital credentialing committee for questionable decision-making, then hired your nephew to fill his position. That's a coincidence, Dr. Mercer whispered. We also found a correlation between your actions and the death of Marcus Webb, the agent said. Your clinical notes indicate you personally examined him, spent 90 seconds with the patient, and documented your assessment as gastritis. No imaging was ordered. No ultrasound. No CT scan. 4 hours later, his aorta ruptured. He arrested in the waiting room. The family's attorney has filed a wrongful death complaint. The Georgia Medical Board has been notified. The hospital administrator cleared her throat. Dr. Mercer, as of this moment, you are suspended without pay. Your access to all hospital systems is revoked. Security will escort you from the building. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. They were the same guards who'd watched Dr. Mercer hide behind the reception desk while Ashley performed thoracotomy on the waiting room floor. One of them smiled slightly as he asked for the badge. Dr. Mercer handed it over with the mechanical precision of a man operating on backup power, running on the last fumes of electricity before total shutdown. His hand shook. His hands actually shook. The guard clipped the badge to his belt, a small metallic sound that somehow carried the weight of a trial. In the hallway, staff scattered out of his path like birds. Not from fear. From disgust. The whispers that had followed Ashley for 3 years now followed Dr. Mercer, but they were different whispers. They were the sound of predators being removed from the herd. Thomas Chen, the former combat medic, watched from his wheelchair near the ICU. He was recovering well, the gunshot had missed anything critical, and his hand still worked perfectly. When Mercer passed, Chen nodded slowly to Ashley. Not a greeting. A confirmation. The kind of nod between people who've seen the worst and survived anyway. The Brigadier General called Ashley into a smaller office within the hour. No interrogation. No formal statement. Just a conversation between 2 people who understood that some things don't require explanation. Your file says you died in a convoy attack, Kandahar Province, March 2018, Holloway said quietly. I did, Ashley replied. Official records indicate Captain Ashley Cooper's remains were transported to Dover Air Force Base. Her family was informed. A memorial service was held. Your mother received the flag. Yes. That was a necessary fiction. You went dark for a reason. There was a leak. Someone in my unit had been selling operational details to Taliban intermediaries. The attack on the convoy wasn't random. The wrong people knew the route. I saw the pattern before anyone else did, and I reported it. The investigation went places it shouldn't have gone. People with access and clearance were involved. So I became a problem that needed solving. I was pulled out, processed as killed in action, and relocated. Holloway nodded. That was 2018. 6 years of being dead. Working as a floor nurse in a hospital where the chief of medicine tried to destroy you. I needed to stay invisible. He made that difficult. He made that impossible. And then he broke federal law trying to finish the job. He didn't know who he was destroying, but that doesn't matter. The law doesn't care about intention. A pause. The sound of hospital machinery hissing somewhere distant, that particular acoustics of a place where lives hang on decisions measured in millimeters. You have 2 options, Holloway said. First, we can process you back into the system. reactivate your commission, assign you to Walter Reed or Lackland, get you back into the military apparatus where you belong. Your record would be cleared, your rank restored, your benefits reinstated. You'd be captain again, officially. And the second option? You stay. Cedar Creek Medical lifts your suspension, clears your record, and offers you a position with actual authority. The hospital director is prepared to make you trauma department head. Full clinical autonomy, hiring authority, budget control. Your choice whether to take it. Either way, Dr. Mercer goes to trial. Either way, you're no longer invisible. Ashley's hands rested on the table. Scarred hands. Capable hands. Hands that had held lives together in places most people couldn't imagine. I stay, she said. It wasn't a question. Holloway smiled slightly. I thought you'd say that. You were always better at healing than fighting, Cooper. Welcome back to the world, Captain. 2 years later, Cedar Creek Medical's trauma department ran like a single organism coordinated by one intelligence. The whispers had changed completely. She can intubate in the dark. I watched her decompress a tension pneumothorax with a ballpoint pen when we ran out of needles. She trained that resident better than the surgeons. The rumors were all true. Ashley's office sat on the 4th floor, a space she'd once thought would never belong to her. Behind her desk hung 2 photographs in matching frames. The first showed 12 Special Forces soldiers in Baghdad, dusty and exhausted under desert sun, half their faces marked with small crosses she'd added herself. The second showed her surgical team, 8 nurses, 4 residents, 2 attendings, all in Cedar Creek scrubs, all with the same expression, trust. Below them, a plaque read Captain Ashley Cooper, Trauma Director. Thomas Chen worked as a patient advocate in the emergency department. Once a month they had coffee in the hospital cafeteria. They didn't talk about Baghdad. The silence said everything. David Webb recovered completely and now volunteered with a patient safety foundation, telling his story to medical students. That nurse walked toward danger when everyone else ran. That's what medicine is supposed to be. Dr. Mercer taught CPR certification classes at Parkside Community College for minimum wage. His medical license was permanently revoked. Former colleagues crossed the street when they saw him. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Ashley stood in Trauma Bay 1 teaching a new resident needle decompression technique. Confidence matters more than speed, she said, guiding the resident's hands to the correct position. Trust your training. Commit to the movement. Hesitation kills patience. The resident practiced on the simulation dummy. Ashley saw determination in that young face, the same determination she'd worn in a desert a lifetime ago. The radio crackled. Mass casualty incident inbound. 6 minutes out. Her team assembled with practiced efficiency, each person moving to their position. Ashley felt the familiar calm settle over her shoulders like an old uniform she'd never quite stopped wearing. Her voice dropped an octave. Let's go to work, people. Her team moved like they'd done this 1,000 times together. Because they had. Because when you work under someone who's walked through fire, you learn how to stand in the heat. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.